Schönen guten Nachmittag nach Österreich and good morning to our speakers in Canada. I will first give a quick introduction and then shortly pass it on to our speakers for today's webinar. Just as a quick reminder, today's webinar will be held in English. My name is Carolina Klemm and I'm the Deputy Head of our Außenwirtschaft Center here in Toronto. Together with our team, we are here to support your business endeavors on the Canadian market. And today we are more than happy to have some great experts with us who would introduce us to the Canadian startup landscape. Just a quick short overview of our agenda for today's webinar. We will quickly go through some housekeeping rules before I'll have the honor to introduce you to Sia from the Business Development Center of Toronto, who we partnered with for today's webinar. She will give you a high-level overview and kick off the session with some information on startups in Canada, the programs of the TBDC, and an overview of the center. Furthermore, we are extremely happy to have John with us today, who will talk about funding for startups and compliance and all the paperwork that's required to leverage those funds. And last but certainly not least, we have Sam with us, who will speak on the incorporation and general about the considerations to start a business in Canada. Since we want this format to be as interactive as possible, we strongly encourage every one of you to engage in the conversation, especially at the end of the webinar. There will be a Q&A session with plenty of time. So please unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and make it a conversation rather than a presentation. All the questions that come up during the webinar already can be written into the chat, and we will go through them accordingly later. The housekeeping rules, this webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded, and you can later on find it on our Außenwirtschaft Austria YouTube channel, as well as the YouTube channel of the TBDC. You will receive the links to those recordings and also the presentations within this week. As you've already seen, your microphone and camera are muted at this point, but that's only for the presentation part of the webinar. Later on, as I mentioned, just raise your hand and we will make sure to unmute you and enable your microphone so you can ask your questions. If there's any more questions or we run out of time, please feel free to just email us to toronto@bko.at and we will make sure to distribute the questions accordingly to the speakers. Now, without further ado, I want to pass it on to Sia, our first speaker and expert. So please take over control of our presentation, Sia, and very happy to have you and excited for all your remarks.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Carolina. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here today. For those of you guys who do not know me, my name is Sia. I'm Director of Marketing for TBDC, and I handle our programs that help innovation move in from the European and APAC markets. TBDC has been around for a really long time, and I'll get into that in just a second. But my portion of the presentation will be pretty short today because we have brought two very wonderful partners of TBDC who are able to give you a lot more detailed experience and information about what it takes to realistically grow your company in Canada. Would love to know later how many of you guys are actively selling into Canada or plan on selling into Canada in the next year, because that's what we specialize in. So let me use my arrows. TBDC has been around since 1990. When we were originally founded, we were founded by the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario to help Main Street businesses launch, grow, and expand. During that time period, we had two unicorns come out of our program. One is Turtle Island Recycling Corporation, which was later bought by GFL. They started by sorting garbage in our parking lot to try and find new profits from waste streams. And the other one is HydroStore. So they have this really cool technology where they basically take overloads from green energy grids and then store it in balloons underwater. And then those balloons fill up in the day when there's an excess of energy, and at night they spin a turbine as they shrink to help manage grid infrastructure. And they have projects all over the world. They're currently working on a very big project in Japan. And Curtis and Ted Manziaras, who are the founders of each of the respective companies, come back often and give back to our community. So it's really exciting to see the type of community that we've built with the 9,000 founders that we've supported. Since 2013, we've been helping international founders move into the Canadian market, first through the Startup Visa program, then through skilled trades initiatives, and now through EIC co-funded programs, which I'll get to a breakdown in a second. But we work sector agnostically across all different types of life. We run 8 different programs, everything from partnering with your local public library here in Toronto to help people write their first business plan, to helping all of our alumni go into fundraising mode. Why should you be considering Canada? I know for a really long time, the US was seen as the biggest, is still the biggest market in North America, but being located in Canada gives you access to the US market at a cost benefit. Our dollar is on average about 30% cheaper. So it's a great place to extend your runway, to get access to the same types of talent that are being hired into the US. And we have tons of free trade agreements, government-backed R&D, and tax incentives that John will go into very big detail about, and an incredible tech ecosystem that is all here to help foster innovation. We have something called the Toronto Waterloo Innovation Tech Corridor. TBDC alone partners with 144 organizations across that region to help companies like yours in all different walks of life and in all different sectors get access to the infrastructure they need to allow innovation to happen. I'm going to glaze over this because John is going to talk to you about it in much more detail, but when you receive the slides, at least this will give you some insight into the types of R&D and innovation support that Canada offers. And we know that building world-class tech takes a really long time, but there's some things that you should know when you're planning to enter the North American market if you haven't already. Canada itself is very relationship-driven. It has longer procurements and sales cycles than some of the people that we've talked to across the world. And North American buyers really like a story and a heritage brand, or they like to know about the founder themselves rather than just the product that they're buying. So these are all things that we help coach you through to make sure that when we introduce you to the North American market, you're ready to make the sales. TBDC does this through an equity-free program that does individual growth plans for every startup that we work with. Depending on what you need, we'll match you with people and do all the groundwork and the shopping beforehand, so that when we put you in the room with somebody, they already know your technology and they're ready to talk business. This program has been running for a little over a year now. We helped 35 companies last year. They were collectively valued at $76 million before moving into the North American market. And we're on our way to helping another 50 this year. So we are pretty selective with the startups that we choose, but we know that we're choosing you because we believe in you as a founder, and we believe in the technology and your ability to crack the North American market. So we do this through 3 different products. One is called your Scout Report. This is market validation and feasibility study. We match you with a Canadian and a US expert who will work with your company for 8 weeks before you arrive to make sure that you understand messaging, positioning, pricing, potential partners, as well as any regulatory hurdles and roadblocks that you could be facing while moving your technology into the North American market. Then we invite you for a sprint week, which is very, very highly customized. We had 23 startups at our last sprint week. It was a little larger than we wanted because we partnered with a VC firm who sent us 8 of their startups in one go. And for those 23 startups, we arranged 349 individual meetings. So this isn't just like, come in, sit with us. You're going to be in a classroom. You're going to learn from, other founders and workshop some ideas. We've actually worked with you for a really long time before you've arrived to define your ICP, to figure out what kind of assistants and clinics that you might need to help grow your company. And we know this model works because at our last sprint week, one of our clients signed their first partner letter of intent on the Wednesday that they had joined us. And then we know building a company takes a lot of resources. So we want you to continue working on your company and building your runway and understanding the work that you're doing. So what we do is we offer a pool of fractional executives here in Canada that you can tap into at any point to help manage any pilot projects, messaging realignments, sales strategies, or just follow up on some of the leads that you met while you were here in person. We also offer a lot of coaching to people who are looking to fundraise here in North America, whether that's through your pitch deck or the coaching of the pitch itself. We work with customers all across Canada, many level enterprise customers, an investment community that is present on both sides of the border. We have professional services, and being in the not-for-profit life, we're funded by all three levels of government. If there are certain people that you need to talk to around regulatory and compliance, or even if you're trying to get those government contacts, we have people who are specialists in procurement and can help you walk through those processes itself. There's also many ecosystem organizations, like I talked about, that are here to support innovative companies growing in Ontario. Like, I cannot say enough how much our ecosystem comes together to work and support innovative companies as they move into the market. When you're getting North American ready, even if you don't come through TBDC, I'd love to give you a few quick tips on how to prepare yourself for this. The first is ICP clarity. We suggest defining a list of 10 to 15 clients that are your go big or go home clients, let's call it that way, and understand not only why they're looking for your solution, but the language that they use around your solution. That can be a really big bottleneck for clients as they start entering the market. It's important to understand the language so that they're not tuning out because you're not using the exact same messaging that they would use themselves. Reddit is a really good place to start looking for this kind of language if you're planning on entering the market. I think it's a very underutilized resource. There's also Answer the Public, and there's also Google Trends, which are all free tools that you can tap into when you're trying to learn what kind of language that your ICP is using. And Canada is really big. It's as expensive for us in Toronto to fly to Europe as it is for us to fly to the West Coast. So understanding which markets you want to break into and grouping your clients together through that will save you a lot of your runway as you're starting to expand into North America. Next is your best practices for commercial. So understanding that, Canada is a bilingual country by nature. It's not only limited to Quebec being French, there's also areas of Manitoba and New Brunswick that speak French. So if you're starting to enter the market, make sure that you're AOTA compliant on your websites and digital materials, making sure that, you're following PIPEDA, which is a little bit different than GDPR, but GDPR is generally more comprehensive in terms of data management and storage when you're contacting clients here in Canada. And understanding any regulatory, if you have packaging around the products that you're selling into the North American market, it has to be in both English and French by default, and there's a lot of standards around that, but we do have specialists that can help consult in that if you are in packaged goods in any way. And then there's the compliance foundation. So if you're going to be ambitious and go after enterprise customers as your first customers in the North American market, make sure that you meet all the regulatory requirements that they hold themselves internally to, so that is not a bottleneck into your first pilot project here in North America. There are lots of organizations, like I keep saying, to help support your growth. TBDC is funded by OCI, the Ontario Centre of Innovation. One of their team members actually sits in our office, so if you come join us in person, lots of opportunities to talk about the funding streams that they have available. They do a lot of sector-specific funding initiatives, and they also do a lot of international tours to help Canadians export globally. So if you're here, you're present, and then you're starting to look at other markets, that's a great resource to tap into. There's ISED, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. They have so many resources and are well connected to just about every sector in Canada. Invest Ontario and Invest in Canada are both incredible organizations that have tons and tons of research that might not be available to the public, but don't be afraid to reach out to them and tell them that you're thinking about entering the market. Their job is to help companies like yours expand here, and they can provide you with additional resources that you might not be able to find just on your own. And then MyTax is a great organization that we have a relationship with at TBDC. They're active all across Canada. Part of their job is to actually fund new research. So if you are looking at retraining an AI model here in Canada, or you're looking at getting into wet labs here in testing, we had somebody with like organ in a bottle versus organ on a chip technology come through our incubator recently, which was really cool. The people at MyTax will help you find universities that have capacity for research and actually fund up to 80% of their salaries to help you complete that research here in Canada. And then BDC is our business bank, so a great resource to tap into once you're a little bit more established and are looking to take out loans or debt equity. And NRC is another program that's in Canada that has tons of wage subsidies for innovative companies looking to make their first couple hires here in North America. The final resource that I'll talk about today is Hello Darwin. The Canadian grants portal is built on legacy infrastructure, let's put it that way. And so if you are looking for the most up-to-date and active loans or incentives or grants and funding, this is a really great tool to help you find what's available out there and is actually open for applications at the moment. Oh, let me see if it'll... Now we're going to hand things over to a longtime mentor for TBDC, John Irwin. And just calling John a mentor is doing disservice to, the background and depth of time he spent working on government grants and funding. I'll let him give you a little bit more of a deep dive, but I was looking at his LinkedIn profile the other day and I was like, how lucky we are to work with such a well-rounded human. So I'll let him take control of the presentation as well, John, and then over to you.
Thank you so much, Sia. And you guys, Sia doesn't give herself enough clout. She's a wealth of knowledge. She's a foundational person at TBDC. So she's great to talk to, and she's great. She's a great resource. So and TBDC is a great organization. I'm glad to be and proud to be a part of it. So today I've got a lot of slides that I'm going to jump through just because I want to provide you with resources that you can go back and look at afterwards, because you'll get a copy of the presentation. So I just want to start with kind of a foundation here. So the different funding options overview. So there's different funding options. There's personal funds, there's equity investments, there's loans, there's tax credits, and there's grants. Today I'm going to be focusing primarily on tax credits and grants and a couple loans, because that's what non-dilutive funding mostly is. Personal funds is also non-dilutive, but that's a whole different ballgame. So let's jump into tax credits versus grants. So tax credits, there are very few tax credits in Canada. The two big ones, which I think I'll touch on both. One is the SR&ED tax credit, which is an R&D based tax credit that is based off of the Frascati manual, and there are pretty much every country that has an R&D tax credit is similar. Canada's is the most lucrative in the world, and I'll get into the numbers when I talk about that. The other tax credit is if you're building a video game or educational for children under 12. So tax credits you apply for after you've spent the money. You apply for it with your tax return, whereas grants, they provide upfront or as-you-go funding. The problem is that they're highly competitive, and demand most of the time often exceeds available resources. So the other thing too is when we're talking about grants, you have to, I like to instill this in people. You must be granted permission before spending the money. So if you have a project that you need funding for, sometimes you have to wait 3-6 months before finding out even if you're approved. So let's talk about the SR&ED tax credit program real quick. It's Canada's largest tax credit program. It's over $3 billion a year. They actually just implemented a bunch of great changes that relate to capital expenditures and public companies. I won't get into that, but if you want to find out more, I do have a LinkedIn post, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So SR&ED being a tax credit, you get it as if you're a Canadian-owned company, it's cash refundable. If you're non-Canadian, if you're a non-Canadian-owned private company, in Ontario, most of it is non-refundable, which means you can only use it towards taxes owed. There is a small portion in Ontario that is refundable still, but it depends on each province. Most provinces don't have a refundable option. It's not only for large companies. You're looking at about 60% for eligible salaries, 35% for Canadian contractor costs, and about 45% for material costs. That's for if you are a Canadian controlled private corp. If you're non Canadian controlled, those numbers are pretty much in half. To determine eligibility, it's simple. You must have a problem with technology that you're trying to resolve where known solutions and known techniques won't resolve that for you. Here are the layman's. So these questions are the questions that the CRA, which is Canada's revenue agency, what they determine. And then this is in layman's terms to make it more easy. So what was the problem? What did you try to overcome that problem? So it's essentially a hypothesis. What was the outcome of your attempts? So you must have multiple attempts iterated on those. And what was the outcome of it? Did you succeed or fail? And what did you learn from that? So you have to have a problem, you have to try things, and you have to have learned from it. Failures are good indicators of shred. And then the last question is, how did you keep track of your work? So if you go to claim an expense, right, they're going to ask for your receipt. That's the same thing with this. You're going to claim your shred, and a lot of times the CRA is going to want to see your receipts. So let's get into grant strategies. The one thing, and I touched on this earlier, is you must secure approval prior to project commencement. So again, you must be granted permission before spending the money. So typically, you can expect 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on the program. 6 weeks is more for the hiring grants. Anything under 50,000, it's going to be a much quicker turnaround. Anything over 50,000, you're looking at 2, 3, 4, and if we're talking hundreds of thousands to millions, 6 months, sometimes 8 months, depending on the program too. So just keep that in mind when if you're looking to come to Canada and you're looking for funding, and I'll talk about the minimum barrier to entry for a lot of these grants in a second. So how best to ensure success? The one thing I always tell my clients is don't create a project to go after a funding program. They will always sniff out the BS if you're creating something just to try to get some money out of them. So try to align it with your business goals. Try to use it to enhance your existing initiatives, and try to come up with a plan, like a grants canvas. The reason for that is because grants open and close throughout the year in Canada. Some are recurring and rolling intake, but most are have set deadlines and set opening and closing dates. So I'm going to get into some grant examples, and I know I'm going to jump over most of them. But again, these slides are here for your reference, so you can kind of see what grants are there. This is definitely not even close to the amount of funding that's available. We're talking maybe about 5,000 different programs, and that includes municipality programs, provincial and federal programs. Ontario probably has 50% of those because we are the largest province. But this is just kind of a little sample. So this is a great one. If you come to Ontario, Starter Company Plus, you can access $5,000 as a micro grant. Each municipality will administer it, so they have different criteria. But this is a great one for a starter company. You get also training and mentoring as well for this one. So this is a great one to apply for. This is a hiring grant. This is great for if you need some minions, some interns, some cheap labor in the summer. Canada Summer Jobs. They'll cover 50% of wages up to of minimum wage, typically up to $4,000 or $5,000. So this is a great one if you're non-for-profit. So if you're coming across your non-for-profit, they'll cover 100%. Again, if you see the key application dates, for 2025 was November 4th to December 11th. So this is one that you have to be aware of and be on top of. If you're coming over to Canada and you have and you're trained in a specific field and you want to get those credentials recognized in Canada, there are microloans for that for newcomers. So these are microloans, low interest, and they'll help you with accreditation. So you must be a permanent resident, a protected person, a convention refugee, a provincial nominee, or a Canadian citizen to apply. And I'll get into more of the eligibility criteria for grants in a few slides here. Here's just another foreign credential microloan program. This is specifically for BC. The microloan for newcomers, I believe, is a federal program, and I'm just kind of giving you an example. There's also provincial programs as well. So, BDC typically will offer loans. They don't really do any grants or tax credits, but they're kind of the entrepreneur's bank, I like to say. So they're dedicated to small and medium-sized businesses. This is just one of their programs, the Newcomer Entrepreneur Program. There's a bunch of eligibility. I'm not going to get into the eligibility and all this stuff just because I want to get into the strategies with you guys, given my time. There's a Women Entrepreneurship Loan Fund for women, offers loans up to $50,000 for women entrepreneurs. This is another hiring grant. You can get, it says 100%, I got to change that to 80% up to an intern salary. Actually, it varies between 80 and 100%, up to $30,000 to offset costs for hiring for R&D. And Sia touched on My Tax. My Tax is a phenomenal program. Modupe is another mentor for TBDC. If you come and work with TBDC, she's phenomenal. This is a great program to get access to PhD and master students, and they'll cover 50% of someone's salary up to $45,000 for a 4-month research project. So. If you're coming and you're creating IP in Canada, there are grants for developing IP strategies. This one specifically for Ontario, there's one IP Assist, which is a federal program, and not every province has its own, so just be cognizant of that. This is a training grant. So once you come to Canada, if you get some sales in Canada and you want to expand internationally outside of Canada, this will help you to export your product outside of Canada. This will give you a grant of $50,000, 50% up to $50,000. So NRC IRAP is the upfront version of the R&D tax credit. So this is a grant version of the tax credit, which you can apply for. It's very difficult to get. It's like an old boys club, but there's definitely some funding there. It provides up to 75% for eligible salaries and 50% for subcontractors. So if you can get in, it's a great program. But there are some minimum barriers to entry, and I'll get into that. I know I keep repeating it, but it'll come very soon. This is the digital media tax credit, which is the video game tax credit that I talked about. So minimum eligibility criteria for any grants over 50,000. So most, and when I say over 50,000, so hiring grants, you can pretty much apply for from day one once you incorporate your company and you start and you're here in Canada. If you're looking for anything over 50,000, here are some minimum thresholds to keep in mind. You must be legally incorporated in Canada for a minimum of 2 years. Your annual revenue has to be at least 100,000 in your previous fiscal year. You must have at least one full-time employee on the payroll who's not a founder. And then there's just some documentation and stuff. But those 3 things are critical. 2 years incorporated in Canada, at least 100,000 in revenue, and at least one full-time employee. So if you're looking for anything other than a hiring grant, this is the minimum criteria. Other than that, well, the Starter Company Plus is a $5,000 micro grant. But so let's get into some application tips. So you want to start researching 3 to 4 months before you want to start your project. That will help you to identify. If you can start 12 months ahead of time and see what's out there and plan that far ahead, that's even better. You want to prepare financial statements, your business registration, tax filings. These are going to be standard things that they're going to ask for, any kind of financial projections. Those are going to be critical. You want to draft your application and you want to focus on measurable outcomes. So you want to quantify economic impact and job creation potential, just to name a couple. You also, if you can, have multiple stakeholders review, and you want to consider having someone who has written grants in the past, maybe you have a friend or a consultant, consider getting them for complex applications. We're talking anywhere 150,000 plus. They start getting quite complex. This is a key one because you have no idea how many times I've worked with a client and they try to submit at the last minute and they run into a problem. So you want to try to submit at least 48 hours before the deadline, and can make sure you get a receipt or you screenshot the receipt just to be safe. So as a summary, most grants over 50,000 require you to be incorporated for at least 2 years. Most grants have income requirements over 50,000. Here are, and Sia touched on this. This is the legacy government grant portal. It's the government innovation portal. It's called the Business Benefits Finder. You can have a look there. You can create a profile. It's still relevant, but not as relevant as other programs. But this one's great. You don't have to sign up. You can just create a profile. The other one is the Ontario Business Grant, specific to Ontario. They get a little bit more granular with the grants. I'll skip over this because I think my colleague is going to be talking about incorporating in Canada. Again, this is a reference slide for you. So here's the secret sauce for grants in Canada. What you want to do is, once you establish a program that you want to apply for, you want to reach out to that organization and try to establish a relationship with a champion within the organization. So you want to reach out and say, hey, I've got a project. I think it aligns. Is there someone I can meet with? And normally that person that you meet with, they'll be more than happy to review your application before you submit it. So when you're writing the application, though, you want to make sure you use the words from the website, from the application guide, as much as you can. So you want to use the funding body's language and terminology. And you also want to relate your project to their criteria as often as you can when you're writing. So the other thing is, if you have $100,000 in revenue and you're asking for $1 million grant, you're most likely going to get denied. So you want to ensure that your funding that you ask for is between about 1.5 to 2.5x of your revenue for your best chance of success. So if you have revenue of 100,000, you want to ask for between 150,000 and 250,000. Some tips for success in Canada. So I'll just touch on the main points, and you can read the bullet points after. So you want to establish a local presence early. You want to navigate the regulatory landscape proactively. You actively want to build your Canadian network, tap into government funding and support programs, understand and adapt to Canadian business culture, like Sia was talking about, access talent strategically, hiring grants, and position for cross-border growth, like Sia had touched on as well. So there's some great strategies here, and there's some more bullet points that'll get into some more details. Thank you so much. I'll post my LinkedIn in the chat for anyone that wants to add me. If you have any questions, you can ask me today or reach out in the future. Thanks so much. And now I'll pass it to Sam, who's a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright Canada.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John, for introducing me and for your great presentation. So I think I've taken control. Clem, could you remind me how to change the slides?
You should be able to click just on your left cursor and it should work.
It's unfortunately not working when I click on the cursor.
I can do it for you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, so thank you and great to be here with you. My name's Sam Zadeh. I'm a corporate partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, which is a global law firm who has a very large presence in Canada. We have offices in each of our major business centers. I've been practicing for about 12 years now, and I have experience working with foreign companies, primarily through cross-border M&A. That's my main area of practice, but I also support companies in forming Canadian business entities and with their day-to-day corporate work. So on the first slide, what we have for you here, the focus of my presentation is to go through the 4 entities that I have here and to give you a general overview of these entities, which in my view are the most common Canadian business entities that a foreign company entering Canada would form. So I've summarized the key features of each of them, which you'll see on this slide. The first one I'm going to go through is a Canadian corporation. The next is an unlimited liability company, a branch entity, and a limited partnership. And at the end of my presentation, I'll give you a brief overview of some IP and employment considerations that may be of interest to you. So that first slide, Clem, that was before this, what I've done is I've summarized the timing to form the business entities. What I would say generally is setting up a business entity in Canada is a relatively quick process, other than in the case of setting up a partnership, which has a bit more complexity to it. The filing fees are also generally nominal. Depending on whether you're forming a federal entity or a provincial entity, the filing fees will be about $200 to $300. And then you would have nominal legal fees working with a lawyer in addition to that to set up the entity. Ultimately, the entity that you're going to choose is more likely than not going to be a Canadian corporation, but the decision you make is going to be very tax driven. So typically, even before you reach out to a law firm, though you could use a tax lawyer at a law firm, you may be working with a tax advisor to assess the business entity that's the most appropriate for you. So as a first point of contact, reaching out to someone who's tax oriented would be my recommendation. So I'll start with a Canadian corporation and we can move to that slide. As I go through each of these entities, what I'm going to do is just give you a general overview on how the entity is organized, the relevant registrations, some relevant compliance considerations, which are generally the same for each of the entities. And then I will also give you a general overview on the tax reasons for forming the entities, but I'm not a tax lawyer, so the depth of what I'll tell you is probably more superficial than you'll ultimately want to get into, but I will give you a high-level overview. So a Canadian corporation, one of the key features of this entity, really from a legal perspective, is that it has a separate legal personality, which means it stands on its own and its shareholders generally have no liability for the debts of the corporation. And the shareholder in your case will be the foreign parent company. So the corporation can be formed either under Canadian corporate laws or under relevant provincial corporate laws. So for example, if you set up a presence in Toronto, you may opt to incorporate an Ontario business corporation, which Ontario is the province Toronto is situated in. There's generally a few differences between the corporate statutes. The main difference, if you take the federal statute versus Ontario, for example, is that when you incorporate a federal entity, you get national coverage on the corporate name as one of the advantages, but there are a couple of disadvantages, which is why people typically go with the provincial statute. One disadvantage is when incorporating federally, the Federal Corporations Act has a minimum director residency requirement. So what that means is that you need at least 25% of the directors of this Canadian subsidiary to be Canadian residents. Typically, foreign companies find that to be disadvantageous, which is why they will go with an Ontario entity, which has no director residency requirements. So the entirety of the board of directors can be individuals who are located in your home countries, and that people find that to be a very attractive feature. In addition to that, the annual filing requirements of an Ontario entity and in the other provinces are typically lower burden than the federal statute. So that's another reason people typically go with the provincial statutes. So generally, assuming your company has an address or operations within a province, our recommendation will more likely than not be to incorporate your company using the provincial corporate law to avoid the director residency requirements. And then ultimately what you do is you incorporate that entity in the home province, and then you complete an extra provincial registration in any other province in Canada where you operate. So for example, if you have an Ontario business entity, but you have operations in Quebec, you'll do a filing with the Quebec registry as a result of that. In addition, when you're establishing the entity, you're going to do, and you're going to automatically get a few tax registrations and numbers that will be relevant to your entity, including HST and GST registrations to the extent you have sales in Canada and are charging tax. So a Canadian business entity from a compliance perspective, and this will be a common theme with the other entities, and I noticed it was referenced in one of John's slides, but typically one of the biggest compliance requirements is that you have to maintain a register of individuals of significant control. So that means if the name, date of birth, address, and country of residence for any individuals who have 25% ownership or control directly or indirectly through the entity. So for example, if you have a majority shareholder of the foreign parent company, our significant control registers see through that all the way to the top. So you'll need to maintain that register and provide that information on up to the ultimate beneficial holder with the different governmental agencies. So the main thing when it comes to tax for a Canadian corporation is interest and dividends that are paid by the Canadian company to its foreign shareholder will generally be subject to withholding taxes, and that withholding tax is at a 25% tax rate unless it can be reduced under an applicable treaty between your home country and Canada. So that's typically the assumption, but there is wiggle room to adjust that tax rate based on the treaty with the specific country. So we'll move on to the next entity, which is the ULC entity. So a ULC can be formed only in specific provinces of Canada that provide for this type of entity. The main ones are British Columbia, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. We generally recommend forming a ULC under the BC Corporate Act because it's the most modern regime that we have for ULCs. And then it also does not require any Canadian resident directors, given it's the BC corporate law. And I mentioned the provinces do not have generally a director residency requirement. The situation where you'll be forming this entity is mainly if there's an advantage from a US tax perspective, in case you have already a US business entity or presence. A ULC will typically be formed as a direct subsidiary of that US parent company that's within your group structure. It's very tax driven. So although ULCs are taxed at the regular corporation tax rate, what they can do is they can elect for US tax purposes to be a pass-through entity or a partnership, which allows them to consolidate their income or loss with that US parent. And that's attractive because if it's expected that the Canadian operations will have some kind of startup loss or tax depreciation on its assets, then those losses or depreciation can be applied against the US shareholder for US tax purposes. So ultimately you get a US tax advantage out of this structure. So that's typically why we form this entity. It may not be relevant in your case to the extent you don't have US operations or a US presence. One of the distinctions between this type of entity and a Canadian corporation is that a ULC shareholders may be liable for its debts in certain circumstances. So one scenario is if you form a ULC and then you ultimately dissolve a ULC under the BC Corporate Act, the shareholders and former shareholders of the ULC will be jointly and severally liable for the ULC's debts and liabilities relative to the entity's creditors. So that's a distinction that people may view as a disadvantage as compared to a Canadian corporation. From an ongoing compliance perspective, again, a ULC will have record-keeping obligations to maintain information about individuals that hold a significant control in the entity, so very similar to a Canadian corporation. And and it's an annual requirement that we covered when discussing the Canadian corporation. So then we can talk about the next entity, which is a branch entity. So a branch entity really is not a distinct legal entity. It's really your foreign entity carrying on business directly in Canada. And what will happen is that the entity will operate in Canada through specific registrations in each of the provinces where it has business. It will also receive, as a result of those registrations, tax registrations for income tax, sales tax, and import-export duty purposes. From a tax perspective, a foreign corporation that carries on business directly in Canada will be considered to be a branch under tax laws. And typically, a branch will have, again, a 25% tax rate on its profits unless there is a tax treaty. However, in some cases, it's very specific to your entity. You may be able to take advantage of a $500,000 branch tax exemption, which you can apply against the Canadian startup losses when forming your new entity. So there are some potential tax advantages that make this approach desirable for people entering Canada. You can later, at an appropriate time, incorporate the branch by transferring the assets and liabilities of the branch to a Canadian corporation. So you will ultimately go down the same stream as the first entity that we discussed. But if you end up taking that approach, there needs to be tax planning because that conversion from a branch to a Canadian corporation may have some tax consequences that may be adverse. So if you ultimately are in that situation, it would be something you'd be working with your tax advisors to look at closely and make sure that it's the right move for your entity. In addition to general tax considerations, there's a specific withholding tax regulation that applies to Canadian branches. So any payment that's made by a customer for services rendered by a branch in Canada will be subject to an additional 15% withholding tax. We can move on to the last entity. So the last entity is a Canadian limited partnership. It's possible to operate a Canadian business through a partnership, even when the business is effectively wholly owned by the foreign parent. A partnership offers limited liability as with a corporation. And in most cases, you have the same tax transparency in Canada and in the foreign jurisdiction. It's usually the most expensive structure to set up because you have a limited partnership agreement and other more complex legal agreements that govern the entity. And typically, the structure would be that the partnership would be made up of the foreign entity as a limited partner, and then you'd have a newly formed Canadian entity as the general partner. The limited partner would be entitled to all the profits of the partnership, and its liabilities would be limited to the capital that it's invested into the partnership. The general partner, which is the management or control entity, is the entity that would be liable for the debts of the partnership, and it will have only invested a nominal amount of capital into the partnership. From a tax perspective, a partnership does not have the advantage of having a separate legal personality. Its income or loss is also calculated as if the partnership were a separate person that's resident in Canada, and then it's allocated as a liability through the partnership to its partners. The non-resident partner will be subject to the same Canadian income tax obligations as if they operated directly through a branch, and the same treaty benefits and limitations that we discussed when discussing a branch entity would apply in this case. So that was the overview of the four entities. Again, most commonly, you're going to be forming a Canadian corporation, and it's very simple to do so. In terms of other considerations when forming a legal entity, typically, especially people who are in the technology space, you'll immediately be thinking about IP considerations and obviously hiring your team, and there are additional regulatory considerations. So I thought it would make sense to briefly touch on these. So in Canada, in terms of IP, the use of trademarks typically creates a common law right in the trademark, and your subsequent use of the trademark or on your goods or services may prevent others from using the trademark. So we have these things that we refer to as common law rights in intellectual property, and it's typically a right that's gathered through use. In addition to that, we obviously have the ability to register IP, and that generally provides a greater scope of rights, including the right to exclude the use of trademarks across Canada relative to specific goods and services. Typically, trademark registrations in Canada are valid for 10 years and then renewable for additional 10-year periods upon the payment of a maintenance fee. In Canada, we also have obviously a patent regime that gives you the exclusive right to use, make, or sell your technology. We also have an industrial design regime that's very similar to the US regime for design patents, and that obviously relates to how your product looks and is marketed. We'd expect that trademarks used by both a foreign parent and a Canadian subsidiary to be owned by one or the other entity. And then typically what you'd do is you'd set up an intercompany licensing agreement so that the entities can benefit from each other's IP. On employment, once you establish the entity and you start hiring people, typically you'll have an employment agreement, and the most important covenants in those agreements are IP assignments in the case of technology companies, as well as confidentiality restrictions. Each of those employment agreements will be governed by the laws that apply in the province where the employee is hired. Overall, the legal requirements from an employment perspective are very similar across Canada, except if you do hire employees in Quebec, Quebec does have typically, in many cases, including employment laws that differ. So you'd need to work with like a local Quebec office of a law firm or a local firm because there are substantial differences in employment law. Obviously, in Canada, we have government-sponsored health insurance that's not dependent on your employment. But many employers, in addition to that government-sponsored health insurance, provide employees with additional benefits and supplementary government health care. So that's often a big consideration when establishing your workforce in Canada. And the last thing that I'll touch on is just from a regulatory perspective, we have two main pieces of legislation that should be considered when you're entering into Canada. One is our Federal Competition Act, which is administered and enforced by our Competition Bureau. And then we have a foreign investment legislation called the Investment Canada Act. As a foreign business entering the country, you'll need to notify Industry Canada and the ICA when you're establishing your investment in your Canadian entity. The establishment of the entity is typically only subject to that notification, and there's generally not a review that's conducted by either regulator if the business does not have a business that you would refer to as a cultural business. Cultural businesses are more regulated, so you do have an additional review before you're able to enter the market in certain circumstances. But I'd imagine in your case, in many cases of the individuals on this call, that will not be applicable. So that was a lot of information, but that was what I wanted to talk about today about establishing a Canadian business entity, and I hope that was useful to you also. I'll put it back to Clem and Sia.
Thank you so much, Sam. Sia, I leave it to you for a few concluding words.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Everyone on the call, I know that was a very knowledge-heavy session, so we appreciate you showing up. We appreciate you staying engaged. You know, the Canadian market is very open and receptive to global technologies at the moment. I don't know how many people have been following our Prime Minister, but a lot of his speeches have been about diversifying our trade partners. So Canadians are excited to learn about new technologies, and they're actively looking for these partnerships. If any of you guys know about Horizon Europe, Canada just became able to lead consortia on that project, and on that webinar call 700 Canadian firms showed up to learn about how to work closer with Europe. So now's the time if you're curious about it. TBDC is here to help, and please let us know if you have any questions at all, whether it's about next steps, whether it's about where to go in the market, whether it's about funding or legal. We're here to answer, and we have another half hour to listen to any questions that anyone might have. So I think you just raise your hand, and the Advantage Austria team will unmute you, and we're here to chat.
Okay. So there haven't been any questions in the chat yet, but as Sia just mentioned, feel free to raise your hand. I can unmute anyone, and we're open to have a discussion with all the speakers of today's call as well.
And if people are feeling shy, then I'm happy to kick something off. A question for John Irwin. What is one grant that you would say is underutilized for new companies looking to expand into North America?
Oh, good question. I feel like a lot of companies don't take advantage of the hiring grants. I feel like a lot of them that come to Canada, I don't know why they don't think of it, but a lot of them don't take advantage of them. You can use it for, a lot of times you can use it for yourself as a founder. Sometimes you can't, but it all depends on the program. But there's tons of different hiring grants that you should explore. If you hire someone with disabilities, or you hire an underrepresented group, there's a lot of different ones. And the other one is the Starter Company Plus as well, the $5,000 micro grant. It's only in Ontario, but it's a great little help for you as you come to Canada with all the costs that you're incurring, if you're able to access that too. Good question.
We do have a question now, Mr. Baumgartner, if you want to.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you, Gia, John, and Sam for great presentations. Thanks, Carolina, for coordinating. I'm an Austro-Canadian, spent a lot of my time in Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta as the main provinces, and then a lot of time in Western Austria, where I'm based again for the past 4 or 5 years. I was really curious because, Sia, you basically explained the nice NAFTA, or now USMCA kind of access that Canada still offers. However, we know what's been going on in the last year or two. How many Canadians are really, like you just said, many are looking to Europe? What are the main hurdles for Canadians to come to Europe, and what are the main hurdles for Europeans coming to Canada? Because it's, if I may add, my experience being in the foreign direct investment topics in, for example, Western Canada was very much a view to Latin America and APAC, and Europe was out a few years ago. Now it seems with all the turmoil that Europe is in again. So I'm very curious at your assessment of what are the main hurdles in each direction. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you. That's a very big question. So let me start with Europe to Canada, or Europe to North America. There's a couple things that I see going on with the companies that we deal with. One is just understanding how much runway they might need to expand, having a deep understanding of how long it takes to roll out pilot projects, and also regulatory approvals for cross-border. If you're working on IP heavy industry, sometimes you might need to go through licensing and regulatory. regulatory, which can take a few years off your runway. So it's better to start early. It's better to speak with specialists who know your technology and your industry very, very well, who can guide you through that to make sure that you're going through that as few times as possible to make sure that you're extending your runway and your ability to sell into Canada. That's number one. Number two is Canada wasn't considered as a major player from Europeans as far as I'm aware of. Like a lot of the conversations that I have, I would say about 60% of my job is selling Canada on an international stage. I had the pleasure of representing TBDC in 9 countries last year, 4 countries so far this year, and all of the conversations I have, people aren't aware that Canada has many strengths and also regional strengths, like deep technology expertise that startups can tap into. So awareness is the biggest problem for Europeans coming to Canada. For Canadians going to Europe, there's 2 things that are going on. One is also education on this side of the pond. When I have conversations with founders about where they want to go in Europe, what they're planning to do, I've had some frankly embarrassing conversations where founders think that the UK is the only market that speaks English. So there's some of that education that needs to go on, number one. Number 2 is regional strengths. Like people don't know that Latvia has a fintech sandbox where you can test your technologies with all of the major banks. There's people who don't know that Austria does more than just life sciences. So that kind of education is also important. But other than that, Canada doesn't have EIDs. So if we're signing contracts with European countries, the first time, like nobody has any of these EID systems set up for biometric scans, for digital contracts, and also banking and regulatory can take a few days to set up. So just having that like entry-level, base-level knowledge so that you're prepared to do business, I think is the important next step in bilateral trade from what I'm experiencing on a founder level. But happy to hear other opinions as well.
Thank you from my side.
Amazing. And I see we have a question in the chat here. As I have understood, establishing a company in Canada is easier, legal markets and grant in Toronto or Vancouver than in Montreal, right? ? What are the best touch points to get in contact with universities? So that sounds like 2 questions. Sam, over to you for the first part of that question.
I wouldn't characterize it as easier necessarily. I would just say when establishing an entity in Quebec, there's additional considerations. So one that I mentioned is the laws can be different or diverge from other jurisdictions, such as their employment laws. And then the other main one that comes to mind is there's specific language laws in the province of Quebec that are in addition to other requirements that you may have from a legal perspective. I don't know how relevant that would be beyond, for example, your corporate policies would need to be in both English and French. If you had labeling or packaging for your technology to the extent it's a widget, there would need to be obviously that information that's shared both in English and French. So there is an incremental requirement that I suppose you could say makes it slightly more difficult, but it's all within reason and all manageable. It's just you have to think about a few more things.
Perfect. And then for touch points to get in contact with universities for R&D, selfishly, I'm going to say come to TBDC. We're here to help you connect with everyone in the ecosystem. That is literally our job. But if you don't want to work with us, which I won't be too offended about, please go to MyTax. They are a wonderful organization. They have specialists in absolutely every area of the innovation economy. And so they're very good at routing you to the right places. Over to you, John.
Yeah, just one thing to note is I don't know how it is in Europe. I did do some R&D in Ireland and Scotland, but you don't have to partner with universities to do R&D. You can do it on your own. It's actually easier to do it on your own if you can. Working with universities can be complex and very onerous and take a lot of time because there's a lot of bureaucracy. But there are also grants for you to do R&D with universities. But if you don't have to, I just wanted to bring that up. That's all.
Well, and if I may add on, that's also our job. So please just get in contact with us, and we're happy to facilitate the contacts that are necessary in that case. And maybe Ms. Fisher's question as well. She's visiting Canada and giving a few webinars, doing online consultancy with Austrians and other Europeans, and wonders if she needs a permission or a Canadian company to do that. And if there's something like a green card you could have in Canada before to apply and start a business. I will hand it over to Sam, but so just, you know, you can always send us an email and we will also gather that information for you. But since we have an expert here, Sam, maybe you can answer on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's no additional like green card or other clearance that's required before starting a business. So that's not relevant. It's really, you could next week instruct a law firm to incorporate a company. You just need to meet the director residency requirements that apply to the entity based on which jurisdiction you're incorporating it in. But there's no additional clearance that's required. The one that I mentioned, under the Competition Act and the Investment Canada Act, those are really just notifications, and they're typically done after incorporation. So it's not like there's any barrier to entry prior to forming the entity. So no, I would say that that's not relevant.
Another question. Thank you, Sam. Do the revenue commissioners give guidance or courses on how to get goods simply into Canada as smoothly as possible? A bit like in the old British no dumb question days. Anyone who wants to?
This is a good question. Happy to look in our network to see if somebody offers that kind of service. Now, I know you need to work with a broker, like regardless of getting goods into Canada. The last time I was trying to get physical goods into Canada was like my first job out of my first degree when I worked for a luxury home goods company. So like UPS by default will have these kind of services with you. In terms of like adhering to Canada Border Services Agency and protection, I know that like FedEx has some guides on these, but I don't know if they're geared towards commercial importers rather than just like people importing packages over $800 worth of goods.
We do also have information on that, so we'll make sure to pass it on and email you.
And I know the Trade Commissioner in Canada does webinars. I'm not sure if they'll be relevant to you. I know they do, like, it's mostly for Canadians who are like gateway to Europe kind of stuff. But you never know. You could tradecommissioner.gc.ca if you want to look up that too.
Wonderful. So many great questions, guys. We encourage you to put a few more in the chat if you have time. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much for showing up today. I know thinking about global expansion, there's a lot to consider as a founder. Like I said, Canada's ecosystem is here to help. We're all very collaborative. There's been multiple people on this call who just said email us and we'll help you figure it out. So don't be afraid to leverage us, because that's what we're here for.
Same.
I see somebody asking for my LinkedIn. Let me go find it for you and post it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah. If there's no further questions, also a big thank you to all of you from my side. Thanks to our speakers for the valuable input and for the discussion, and for you in participating, all the Austrian companies. As mentioned, all of us are available for you to help you with whatever you might need to be successful in the Canadian market. You now have all the emails, and of course we are at the Außenwirtschaftscenter more than happy to distribute you and to talk about it initially and find the right partners for you. So reach out anytime, and we're happy to get in touch and help you with any big or small steps we can provide you with on the Canadian market. Have a great afternoon, and thank you, Sam, John, and Sia especially. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
Thanks
guys.
for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks for everything.